Welcome to Conversations with Tedx Yangon. I'm Dr Thant Myint-U, and I'll be your host for the upcoming hour, where we'll be joined by our guest, Dr Thant Myint-U. We're waiting for a few more people to join, so relax, grab yourself a drink, make yourself comfortable, share the stream with friends, and maybe even host a Facebook Live watch party. While we're getting started, I just want to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about Tedx Yangon and this conversation series. Tedx Yangon is run by a group of volunteers, including me, and we came together about 5 years ago to start organizing TED-like events under license from TED. And TED, most people will be aware, but they are, of course, very well known for the conferences and TED Talks that come out of those conferences that are shared and viewed globally, millions and millions of views, some of them. And what we've been doing at Tedx Yangon is to host similar conferences. We do annual conferences, and we post our own TEDx talks. And why we started doing it has to do with our belief in the tagline, TED and TEDx tagline of ideas worth sharing. And I think we should put some context to this word ideas, especially with regards to where we are, which is in Yangon, Myanmar, where ideas for so long were seen as something dangerous, and they were indeed dangerous. You could get yourself in jail or worse for sharing ideas, and therefore we were cut off from conversations and sharing for so long. Not even ideas coming in from outside, just in between the country, between people, and even in our own minds. The idea sharing and idea generation was curtailed because of the education system being so poor for so long. So we really believe in Tedx Yangon of these conversations, and where we are today with you now, the Conversations with Tedx Yangon series was born actually out of the current situation that we have with COVID-19, where we felt this need to connect with our community, and normally we would have done it in person, but obviously cannot. But then we completely embrace this idea, and we're so excited to be here with you today, so excited that you can be with us. Thank you for spending part of your weekend for what I hope would be a very interesting hour with us. So I think it's time for me now to introduce our guest, Dr. Thant Myint-U. It's funny because when we were writing the bio to publish for when we were advertising this, we struggled. We struggled to have a succinct story of Dr. Thant Myint-U, because he is so many things, and he does so many things. So I'm actually going to read a little bit on the various aspects of Dr. Thant, and we hope that over the next hour or so we can cover some of these facets of him. So Dr. Thant Myint-U, really, he's most well known, I think, as a historian. Hello, Thant. Good morning.
Hi. Good morning.
And good morning, Thant. So I'll just do a little bit of a preamble introduction, and we can take it from there, because as I was saying, we found it so difficult, to say who is Dr. Thant Myint-U, and I think a lot of people know you as a historian. That's your training. You're a former fellow at Trinity College in Cambridge. You've written a number of books about and which are all related to history, and you also have a history website, Lost Footsteps. But you also spent many years at the United Nations, over 13 years, in fact, doing peacekeeping operations around the world. And then you were back at the head office in New York, I believe, where you were leading, you were director of policy planning. And we would love to cover some of the experience that you had in the UN here as well. And where we overlap is your role as a conservationist. You founded Yangon Heritage Trust in 2012, and I have the honor and the pleasure of sitting on the board of trustees. And and there, we're talking about preserving cultural heritage, as well as having livable cities. But beyond that, you've also got into climate change. You've talked quite a bit about climate change, especially with regards to how it might affect a place like Myanmar. And you've been working on biodiversity conservation projects. And last but not least, you have been quite involved in the public affairs of Myanmar, especially, and you've been a former presidential advisor. You've worked a lot with foreign governments coming in and acting as this bridge. So it's incredible, and thank you very much for spending time with us. We've actually, I think, tried several times to see if you could join us on the Yangon stage, but you are a very, very busy man. And one of the blessings of this COVID-19, there's always something good in when bad things happen. And I think one of the blessings is that we've been able to get your time where normally you would be traveling and having that incredibly busy schedule. So thank you again.
No, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here on this beautiful Sunday morning. I think it's the longest I've been in any country now since I was looking back, probably since 1983, since I was quite young. And so I am here now and very happy to be with you here on this forum.
Thank you, Kota. I'm struggling to see where we should kick off, but let's kick off with the work that you've been doing with the Yangon Heritage Trust. And sometimes when people hear the word heritage, they think, oh, it's about preserving old buildings, but it's really so much beyond that. I think it's about creating livable cities, and it's not even about lifestyles. It's also about the economy of not just Yangon, but what Yangon can bring to the country in general. So can you talk a little bit about what got you interested in this in the first place? What got you into founding the Yangon Heritage Trust and the activities that you've been doing with it since then?
I mean, in 2012, when I founded the Yangon Heritage Trust, I really had no background in the issue. I hadn't thought about urban planning at all. I hadn't thought about architecture. I knew almost nothing about architecture. All I saw at that time, and I had seen over the past few years that I'd been coming back to Yangon, was so many beautiful old buildings that seemed to be in danger. So many old buildings that I remember from childhood and when I was a teenager having been torn down, others in a really dilapidated state. And when things started to change in Myanmar for the better, as we all thought back in 2011, 2012, I thought, wouldn't it be a great thing, at least if the government tried to save these old buildings and do something with them? So it did start really from a very narrow perspective of simply wanting to preserve and to save the old downtown in Yangon. But then I think once I started talking with a lot of Myanmar people, architects, historians, business people, and others, it became very clear to me that there was this enormous potential, not simply of saving these buildings, but of really transforming downtown in a way that would be great for the residents, that it wouldn't just be about the buildings, but it would be about these amazing communities that had lived downtown, multi-ethnic, multicultural communities that have been there for generations, that this could be a great driver of tourism. It could put Yangon on the map as a world tourism destination. But even more than that, that simply having a beautiful city and preserving this architecture would be part of creating a beautiful, livable city, would be a tremendous asset for this country going forward in terms of its economy and in terms of its overall development as well. So I started thinking about lots of different things, but it was in conversation with literally hundreds of people over those few years. I founded the Yangon Heritage Trust in 2012, and for the next 3 or 4 years, I worked a lot in trying to promote this vision and promote the idea of integrating this old architecture into a new vision of the future.
And this vision of the future, and I think we'll come back to it, because there was something that you said a few years back that really resonated with me, which is that, and I'm paraphrasing you, which is this, the failure of us, maybe as a society, is the failure of, lack of imagination. And with Yangon, I think you've written before as well that we can imagine, a different future, a different Yangon. Let's think about ways to make it more vibrant, more livable, or retain some of the such rich diversity and heritage that it has, and also affordability. And then, I want to touch on that aspect as well in various ways, because in Myanmar and other countries that develop, there is a danger that gentrification could push out old residents who've been there for generations, and in the country as well as it develops, there could be inequalities that emerge. And how do we sort of give a future that everybody can buy into, not just in the city, but in the country?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of imagination is really important, and it links back to something else, which is that, Myanmar has been a poor country. Myanmar has been under military dictatorship. Myanmar has been at war with itself for many generations. But Myanmar is also perhaps different from so many other countries in the region in the extent to which it's been isolated from the rest of the world. I mean, there were always some people from this country that were able to travel, but it was very, very few until the 1990s. And even until 2011, it was a relatively small elite that went abroad, other than migrant workers who also started to travel abroad. But what that meant was that, unlike people in many other countries, people didn't have the experience of seeing, if we go back to the example of the Yangon Heritage Trust in Yangon downtown, people didn't have the experience of seeing cities from around the world. They didn't have the opportunity to see cities that were in decline, or cities that were prospering and livable and exciting and doing new things. And so when people in Myanmar looked at Yangon, they weren't able to easily imagine what the different options might be, not just in terms of conserving the old buildings and integrating that into a vision for the future, but thinking more generally about urban planning, what the economy could be, what the issues around inequality might be, and how to address them because of this isolation. And I think for the Yangon Heritage Trust, the biggest issue or the biggest challenge has been kind of almost to tell people that, or explain to people, or try to convince people that the kinds of priorities that the city has in terms of infrastructure, in terms of growth, are legitimate and important. But if we compare it with many other cities in the region and around the world, that if we go 20, 30 years into the future, and Yangon is hopefully a much bigger economy and a much richer place, that we will at that point really regret destroying what we have right now. So it's trying to broaden people's perspectives on what is possible, and then leaving it to hopefully a democratic discussion in terms of what people might actually want in the future.
Can we take that last bit and expand, which is this democratic discussion? You mentioned in your book, and I think in some of the conversations that you've been having elsewhere, that we really haven't had an opportunity in this country to have a public debate, a public kind of discussion about where we want to be as a society and where we want to be as a country. And there are, of course, layers of complexity involved in that. And you mentioned in your book that the modern state of Burma was formed as a military occupation, and the Irrawaddy, along the Irrawaddy, there were all these Burma kingdoms, the Myanmar kingdoms that were there before the British colonial times, but then all the hilly regions had a completely different ethnic makeup that may not have ascribed to this nationhood that came to be later, and so much of the history, or the history in quotation marks, that at least I learned growing up, and I think a lot of people learned here growing up, is a one version view of history. So how do we get that public debate going, public conversation going on how we are going to see the possible futures of this country?
I think the first most important thing is that it's so important to teach kids history, and to teach kids history not just a set of not just as a single narrative and a set of dates that they have to memorize, but really trying to understand history and its complexity and from so many different perspectives. I think that's really important. And that's not just a problem in Myanmar, that's a problem around the world. And I think we see this collapse of imagination in so many other places as well, because history is not being taught to kids well, and it's not being taught to kids in a dynamic way. I think if we think about Myanmar, yes, you're right. I mean, this was a country, its current borders were formed during under colonialism, and we had under colonialism not just an incredibly exploitative economic system, but we also had a racial hierarchy for the first time in this country. And we had Myanmar become, then Burma, part of British India, and the immigration of millions of people from what is today South Asia into this country. And so there were issues around identity, nationalism conceived along ethnic lines that grew up alongside anti-colonialism and the nationalist movement in the 1930s and 1940s. And so when this country became independent, we had this nationalist movement that was very much centered around a Burmese-speaking Buddhist identity, because that was the majority community in this country, and that was a community around which nationalists had organized and first demanded a separate identity from India and then independence from Britain. But when the country became independent, it wasn't just the Burmese-speaking Buddhist people who were in this country. There were many different minorities. There were people in areas that the British had administered separately in the Shan Hills and the Kachin Hills and elsewhere, including in regions that the British had barely administered, even as late as the 1930s, and had never been part of any Burmese kingdom. You had places like Arakan, now Rakhine State, that had been its own kingdom until just a few decades before British rule. So then there was this project, or there was this need to kind of meld together this new nation. And it's been a very difficult project ever since. It's been riven with violence and violent conflict. And it's been a lot about not just borders in a physical sense, but about boundaries in terms of who belongs to this country, who should be a citizen of this country, and is there a hierarchy in terms of belonging in this country as well. So that whole issue around identity has really been central to the history of Myanmar really since independence. And I would say that that's the most important part about Myanmar history since independence, together with this story that we've just begun to touch on with the Yangon Heritage Trust, which is the story of the economy of this country. And I think these two issues are the issues that need to be discussed and debated, not just sort of within government or governing circles, but by the people at large. And I think that's what will give weight and content to new democratic institutions and processes in this country.
Yes, and that actually want me to bring in your time at the UN. You served in a number of peacekeeping missions. Myanmar, in a way, is not unique, right? There are other countries around the world that have similar issues with regards to peace and maybe I don't know what the right term these days is to call, but some sort of national unity, or having a common story that people want to subscribe to and build together. So can you share a little bit about, based on your experience with UN in other countries, and it's a struggle for so many that are going through the same, but is there a way forward? We seem to be at a stage where we're plodding along. In a way, we are an incredibly peaceful country, and we're war torn. There are communities here that have been affected by conflict, displacement for generations, persecution for generations. How do we then bring all that in and move forward where it's not an agenda of the Burma versus the ethnic arm organizations? It's really not, right? It's so much more complex.
Yeah, I mean, I worked for the UN I worked in the UN in a couple of different contexts. I worked in UN peacekeeping missions in Cambodia and the former Yugoslavia. And in those places, I mean, this was in the 1990s when the Cold War had recently ended. And so there were many opportunities for the United Nations to try to help and resolve those problems. But what I saw firsthand was just how fragile many societies could be. You look at the former Yugoslavia, which was actually a fairly well-off country, and how it fell apart so quickly in war and civil war in the 1990s. And then I worked in New York in different capacities, including in the Department of Political Affairs. And I think what I learned from those experiences were many different things, but especially I think I got a very good sense of what the limitations of international intervention and involvement in these countries could be. I mean, the UN can play an important role in some of these countries, and it does play an important and positive role in some of these countries. But in the end, it's the people of the countries themselves that really have to get their act together and decide if they want to continue on a path of violence and armed conflict or something else. And we've seen many countries, especially in our region, go on that path of prosperity and greater equality and economic development and succeed. So I think in the Myanmar case, it's not surprising that given the legacies of colonialism, we went into this period of armed conflict and then dictatorship and isolation and many failed economic policies for more than a generation. I think what's really tragic is that we still haven't overcome those challenges today in 2020. And I think part of that is this issue of imagination that we talked about. And I think if we think about what can really pull this country together and help to solve these problems, I would put two issues on the table as the most important. I think first is this issue of discrimination. I think people talk a lot about federalism in terms of decentralization, and I think that's probably a good thing. But I think even more important is just discrimination, that people, regardless of gender, race, religion, ethnicity, language, should be treated fairly and equally across the board, and to have more inclusive state institutions across the board as well. I think that's one. And then the second, and I think the biggest missing piece in terms of pulling this country together into a new direction, is this economic vision that we still, I think, are in many ways lacking. And I think that economic vision in this time of climate change, in this time when China is rising next door every year by the year, in this post-pandemic period that we may be entering over the next couple of years, I think that economic vision and that common economic agenda is going to be incredibly important going forward as well.
And I want to come back to both of those points that you said, about discrimination and this economic vision. But before we do that, you mentioned in your book about the UN, and I want to read this. It says the UN likes to say that its mission everywhere is conflict prevention and peace building. And indeed here, we have both conflict situation and a peace that is seem elusive. And you say, at UN conferences, nations agreed that goals of peace, development, and respect for human rights were intertwined and must be addressed together in holistic ways. These lofty ideas were born of decades of experiences in war-torn societies. They were, however, thrown out of the window in the case of Burma, where the goal was democracy and little else. And I don't think the UN is unique in that. A lot of the well-meaning foreign partners that come in and want to move this newly opened Myanmar into a better direction seem to think that democracy is the way, and Western-style democracy. And there's been very little consideration of the historical path that this country has gone on, the cultural backdrop where even our other Asian neighbors have democracies that in most countries do not resemble Western democracies. What's your thought in that? Are people misunderstanding us? In the desire to do good, is the baby being thrown out with the bathwater? We're talking about this country getting anxious. What should people be thinking instead?
Yeah, I mean that's a whole bunch of big issues in a way. Maybe first to say that in 1988, 1989, when we had the uprising and the immediate aftermath of that uprising, I think the legitimacy of what had been called the Burmese way to socialism had largely collapsed, and people felt that they wanted to come out from under what was decades of repression and past military governments as well. And the mood of the times was very much one around liberal democracy. This was after the Philippines Revolution that overthrew Ferdinand Marcos. This was around the time of the Berlin Wall. And many people didn't want to resist the military by moving further to the left. And so the Communist Party had also collapsed in Burma in 1989. And so people grabbed onto this idea of democracy, which was the big idea at the time. This was the time when people thought that democracy was going to be triumphant everywhere. And I think because there was so much repression in the country and so little room for discussion, there wasn't really a discussion about what kind of democracy or what should democracy mean in the Myanmar context. I think if we fast forward to today, I think we can see all around the world, even in the West, in places where we've had the oldest liberal democratic institutions, that those institutions are not necessarily meeting the big challenges of today, whether it's around identity politics, whether it's around dealing with the pandemic, whether it's around dealing with climate change. And so I think for Myanmar, the answer is not going to be about less democracy. I think the answer is about what should democracy mean in the rest of the 21st century. I mean, people in Myanmar, the average age is 27, 28. Many of the people here are going to be around until the end of the century when climate change could have horrific consequences. It means what kind of deliberative democracy do we want? What does that really mean in this context, as you suggest? I think if we go back to the UN and international involvement, my big frustration at the time, I wasn't allowed to work on Myanmar at the UN because I was a Myanmar national, but I did see in the work that I was doing, it was very clear from all the evidence and all the discussions we were having that you can't just look at one issue like political change around democracy. You had to look at economic issues. You had to look at the armed conflicts in the country, if there were, and come up with, as you said, from my book, a holistic solution. But yet, on Myanmar, people had these blinders, and there was this assumption that it could be looked at in a black and white, two-dimensional way, where there was a military dictatorship, and the answer to everything was simply democracy. And we didn't look at sequencing. We didn't look at the institutional changes that might be necessary. We didn't look at the kinds of economic policies that should accompany initial democratization efforts. We didn't look at the way in which a peace process could accompany a democratic transition. And so in 2011, all of these things came together, and I think the country in many ways was unprepared for the suddenness of the opportunities that were thrown up, and didn't have, through no fault of many people, hadn't had the opportunity to discuss them in the past.
Can we go back to your point about discrimination? And I think it also relates to the definition of what a citizen is in this country. I know a lot of people who are, if you're not Burman Buddhist, it's very that a simple national registration card. I heard a story we had in TEDx. One of our speakers talked about the fact that he's Lee Su, and even though the Lee Su are one of the recognized races, because there are people across the border, it was incredibly difficult for him to get identity. Similar in, we had another speaker who talked about again getting national registration card, and she's ethnic Chin. And of course, we have the whole Rohingya crisis, where the question is, why aren't these people getting citizenship from the international community? But I think there's our citizenship laws seem to be rooted on this idea of ethnicity and ethnic identity. Can you touch on that? Is this something that we can change?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two different but connected issues. I mean, one is the sort of day-to-day discrimination as experienced by people. And again, it can be on the account of race, of people's appearance. It can be on the account of the language they speak. It can be on the basis of people's perception of what ethnic community they belong to. And I think there's a deep history of that kind of discrimination as is felt by people from many minority communities around the country. And I think a radical program to end that discrimination, to have government institutions, whether it's the police or the army or the civil service, that are more inclusive, I think that's an incredibly important first step if we really want to move the country in the right direction. But I think some of this is also just in the realm of ideas and, again, imagination. And it goes back to, like so many things, to colonial times, when in the early 20th century, race and race science was almost everything. And again, as I mentioned before, this was a country that was under colonial rule, which was a racial hierarchy. A certain race of people, Europeans, were at the very top of that hierarchy. Only they could have certain positions in government. Only they could enter certain places like the big clubs, like the PGU club in Yangon or Rangoon at that time, for example. And this had never happened before in Burmese history, where race was so closely tied to hierarchy. And then, as I mentioned before, Burma had been part of British India, and it was separated from British India in 1937, not on the basis of religion like Pakistan, which was partitioned 10 years later on the basis of religion, but on the basis that the Burmese were a separate race. And by that time, the British had also diced and sliced up the country into different racial groups through the different censuses in 1921 and 1931. And I think the Burmese, or the Myanmar people, after independence, sort of internalized a lot of these differences as well, and assumed that these were biological categories that were rooted in centuries or millennia of difference, and that the country had to somehow be this union of not just dozens, but hundreds of these different racial units that the British had identified early in the 20th century. And I think unless we overcome that idea that people are biologically rooted in a certain racial group that goes back to time immemorial, and don't accept the fact, I think, going back and looking at Burmese history, that many of these categories have been incredibly fluid, many of these identities are very modern as well. We can still have these conversations, 100 years in the future. We can still be in armed conflict 100 years in the future. But unless we get over this, we're not going to get onto the path that I think the vast majority of people in this country want to get onto, which is a country which is equal without discrimination, and that is much more economically developed and catches up with the rest of the region. I think that this specific kind of dynamic around identity is what has been holding back this country for such a long time, really since independence in 1948.
Yes, and I think it's also worth noting that I think you mentioned the word, the ethnicities are fluid. If you look at, someone like me, my national registration card says Burmese Buddhist, but in fact, I am, half Shan, and there's probably sprinkling of Chinese and Indian thrown in. And as the title of one of your other books says, we are where China meets India. This is where peoples have come and gone, and there's been a lot of mixes, and there seems to be a very little recognition of that. If the outside world sees us black and white, we seem to see ourselves in this. The little sing song that we had when we were young was, Kachinga Yin Chin, Mumyama Yakai Shan, and we all have this little characters holding hands and dancing around a circle, and that I think is also, in a way, so dangerous, because if you're not one of those, then you're an outsider. And I struggle with that because personally, because I have children who are not full ethnic Burmese, and they are not allowed citizenship. Whereas in a lot of other countries, their human right would have entitled them to citizenship, and it then gets intertwined with the politics of this country as well. So it's so in a way very interesting but complex. But the sad thing is that it impacts humans, it impacts families, and it impacts, as you say, with the discrimination on people on a day-to-day basis.
I think it's really particularly kind of difficult or challenging in this country, because on the one hand, you want to have a liberal view on these things, right? As I was saying before, I think there should be no discrimination. I think that it should be up to people themselves to decide what kind of identity they want to embrace, that we should see identity as fluid and always changing and a very individual thing. On the other hand, this is a country which, because of historical reasons and also because of present circumstance, sees itself as wedged between enormous other civilizations, India on the one side and China especially on another side, and in danger of losing its own identity. And then within the country, you have so many different minority communities who feel so oppressed and discriminated against that anything that looks like it's moving in the direction of why don't we all sort of be the same and treat each other equally and see identity as fluid seems to be a direct challenge against they're preserving their own identity, which they already feel is under so much threat. So it's many different layers of really strong feeling that I think is going to be difficult to overcome. But I think my main point is that we need to start with a program of radical anti-discrimination, so these people are not discriminated against on account of whatever identity they have, and then enable good conversation, which is going to last a very long time. And I think if we make divisions between identities the core of Myanmar politics, I don't think that we're going to get beyond the kind of stage that we're in right now in terms of the problems that we're facing.
So I was in Africa a couple of years back in Tanzania, and I don't have a deep knowledge at all about the countries, but Africa suffers from something similar in that lines were drawn relatively arbitrarily post-colonial times, and nations were formed where people who find themselves in the same border may not agree that they should be clubbed together. And I'm told that Tanzania and Kenya next door actually have very similar ethnic makeups. They're the people that have been moving back and forth who are mostly nomadic, some of them. But as a nation, Tanzania has a stronger unity, but Kenya doesn't because of this identification of people within ethnic lines, which one of the founders of Tanzania took great pains to ensure that everybody feels that they are part of this one country, and it's not about who they are in terms of ethnicity. Do you have views on that, and maybe you know about that, or other countries that might have been more successful putting everybody under a different kind of umbrella?
No, I think there's so many things in this country that are going to be difficult, right? I mean, at least the borders are not disputed, but the boundaries, as I mentioned before, of who really belongs and who doesn't. And then there are always going to be difficult cases because we are next to India, we are next to China, we are in an area where people are migrating back and forth. We do have this history of millions of people from another place coming to this country during a period of extreme exploitation in the early 20th century. Those scars are there and still around and are being amplified by different types of nationalist discourses in this country. And I think it's not going to be easy to overcome these things. So I think we just need to start with for me at least, the most obvious first step, which is not to discriminate against people on the basis of race and religion. And everyone says this. I mean, it's in the Constitution as well. So I think a program that makes sure it doesn't happen is the obvious first step to me. I think this other question of what kind of decentralized government should we have, what kind of federalism might be possible, how to think about the citizenship laws in this country, how to change those citizenship laws in this country, how to think about different ethnic identities that are present in the census. I mean, these things are going to be hard, and they're going to require or should require democratic deliberation. But I think that first step of simply trying to end discrimination, which is rife in this country in so many different ways, I think that's the obvious first and obvious first step and very productive step that we need to take over these coming years.
Thank you. I want to touch on the second point that you brought up earlier, which is about the political economy and the economy as a whole. And you've been mentioning the term welfare state, especially as it relates to COVID-19 and the response and what Myanmar could do, because we have so little in the way of social safety nets. And this term welfare state, it's sometimes, at least for me, it's not a positive connotation, but you mean it in that term, that is actually something desirable. And for those of us who grew up during the failed Burmese way to socialism, socialism is almost a dirty word. So can you talk a little bit about what you mean by this welfare state, and how do we design it so that people don't you don't have free riders? I think Myanmar people in general are very proud, and you don't want to take that away from them. So how are you imagining that?
Well, I think when colonialism ended in 1948, almost everyone in Burmese politics wanted some kind of left-wing government and a set of left-wing policies. And so we had, from 1948 through most of the 1950s, we had a sort of democratic socialist government and set of policies that worked up to a point and failed in certain ways. And then, as you mentioned, we had the army takeover in 1962, and we had the attempt at the Burmese way to socialism, which failed in many different ways. In none of those periods, whether it's in the 50s or 60s or 70s or 80s until the collapse of the Burma Socialist Program Party in 1988, did we actually have a welfare state in any meaningful sense of the word. And by welfare state, I simply mean a government in which people and companies are taxed, and some of that money goes into providing basic services like health and education, but also guaranteeing people a certain level of income, if it's when they're unemployed or in other sort of circumstances. And if we look back in history, it's exactly at that time, after the Great Depression in the 1930s, when Western countries in Western Europe and in the United States developed their welfare state, that they became enormously successful and prosperous. When people had that basic social safety net, when they had basic social security, when enormous amounts of money were invested in health and education, America, for instance, as a capitalist society, reached the real apex of its development in the 60s, especially when that was also accompanied by the civil rights movement and an end to discrimination and discrimination both on racial grounds, but also against women as well. So I think in the Myanmar case, though, what we have is an economic system that has developed now since the collapse of Burmese socialism in 1988, that has produced a certain amount of growth, that has seen over the past 10 years in particular growth and also opportunities for many people that weren't there before. But we still have an incredibly unequal society. And we also have a society in which a large percentage of people really cannot make ends meet. We have high, and I think unacceptably high rates of childhood malnutrition, of infant and maternal mortality, of diseases that are treatable, that are leading to tens of thousands of people dying on an annual basis, people who are destitute, who move to Thailand in search of jobs, or who go up to the mines. And we've seen in Pakant over the past few days how tragic it can be that these people who literally have no other choice become scavengers on the side of a jade mine and then lose their lives as a result. So I think we have within ourselves in this country the resources to end that. And I think that basic set of rights for people to a certain type of living standard, I think is something that can be not just aimed for, but I think something that can be realized relatively quickly in this country.
Absolutely, it's just heartbreaking, the poverty that we see around the country, and especially, contrasted by the fact that so many of our neighbors have escaped it to a level where they probably won't slide back. But I don't believe that we're there yet in our economy where we don't have so many people are still just treading water above the poverty line. I think in the last 10-15 years have managed to lift a lot of people out of poverty, but that slide back can happen so easily, and it's it really breaks my heart, especially what you said about childhood malnutrition, the education level in this country. I think I cried when I heard that the average years of schooling in this country is under 5 years. And for me, it's also incredibly worrying, because how are we going to have those conversations? How are we going to have that discussion when you have people who are malnourished both in the stomach and in the mind, and so many people have to are thinking about just making ends meet day to day. Very few people have savings, and you mentioned recently that requires a more activist government. How do we go from there? How do we go from the 5 years of average schooling to I believe the ASEAN average is around 8, and that will probably take, a generation or at least half a generation. How do we address this issue of creating social safety nets through some sort of distribution from potential wealth? We always talk about the potential of this country, and I've spent now what's probably half my life just listening about the potential, and how do we unlock that so that we really as a society can make sure that the most needy are looked after.
I think it's a couple of different things, right? I mean, I think on the one hand, we've seen over the past 10 years, spending on health and education rise very significantly, and that's welcome, and that's a very good thing. But it's risen from incredibly low levels. So the spending in Myanmar on health was literally one of the lowest anywhere in the world out of 190 plus countries. And so we started from a very low base. We've done a little bit better, and we need to do a lot better. And I think it's not just about doing a little bit better or kind of moving on at a certain pace. I think we need a revolution in terms of healthcare provision and education in this country. And it should almost be on a war footing, in the sense that this is something that absolutely needs to happen, not just in decades, but in years' time. Because for kids, as you know, I mean, even just a few years makes all the difference. So I think this should be at the very center of decision making in this country. And everything. I mean, we have a nearly $20 billion a year government budget. I would argue that a huge amount of that budget should be spent on health and education and providing basic social security for poor people and ordinary people. But I think if we take a step back, I think none of this is going to be possible or sustainable unless we have economic development in this country as well. And I think this issue of a more activist state or a more entrepreneurial state, or simply a state that is much more in directing to some extent the economic agenda of this country and being involved in shaping this economy, is going to be important for a number of different reasons. First is that I think on the one hand, people can talk about liberal and free markets. And I think in many countries in the West that are advanced economies, there's a very legitimate debate to be had about what are the pros and cons about having a very laissez-faire free market economy versus something that has more state control, a more mixed economy as well. I think that's a very legitimate discussion. In our country, we are not starting from a base of zero. We're starting from multiple different challenges, holes in the ground from which we have to rise up. We are in a climate emergency in this country. We are in a country where we have China next door, which has gone from a GDP per capita that is about the same as Myanmar 30 years ago to being 7, 8, 9, 10 times richer today. We have no time left to catch up. And I think that means that we cannot simply leave it to markets to kind of try to find their way over the coming years. We need to have some sort of common vision and agenda about the development path that we're going to go on, and mobilize capital, resources, people's imagination, people's support from within our country to have that kind of development, which basically means a structural transformation of this economy away from a poor agrarian economy towards a more industrialized, manufacturing-based economy, in which Myanmar organizations, Myanmar companies really develop the productivity, the capability, the know-how to be able to produce more and more complex products, not just for the local market, but for the international market as well. So how are we going to do that? We need to have not just that basis in human development in terms of health and education, but we really need that strategy in terms of how we're going to grow those sectors. And I think we really need it urgently. I think that's the missing ingredient. And I think, that's not just about, an obvious single path that the state has to decide on and direct. I think that's a very old-fashioned way of looking at it that's almost bound to fail in this context. But we desperately need the right discussions of the options that we might have, because I think it's that debate that's also going to give real weight to democracy in this country going forward as well.
Can we then talk about sort of, as the development community says, capacity or institutions. There's this weakness of the state. You mentioned in your book that the state seemed strong because the state had a totalitarian color about it, and there was this ability to oppress and suppress. But when it actually comes to running of the state machinery and being able to do that envisioning strategy, analyzing, longer term planning, and really getting all the state apparatus, we have ministries working together, talking together. How do we overcome that, when we have this backdrop of people really who grew up during the period where this country was isolated for so many years, self-isolation, then imposed isolation because of sanctions? I think it's a puzzle that I'm personally struggling to solve.
I think it's on the one hand, it's going to be incredibly difficult. On the other hand, I think it's absolutely essential. I think it's the number one thing, the transformation of government institutions. We talk a lot about constitutional change. There's been a huge amount of discussion about, what democracy can mean in this country in terms of constitutions and federalism and everything else. But we almost rarely talk about what are the actual state institutions that we need to develop this country. What are the bureaucracies we need, the innovative bureaucracies, the thinking bureaucracies, the bureaucracies that can actually help to coordinate and plan and think about and propose to people options for democratic development? What are those institutions going to be in Myanmar? Let me just take a very specific case. It's not maybe the best case, but it's a case that I know well. If you take downtown Yangon, for example, in 2012 in downtown Yangon, we had what I had mentioned at the very start of our conversation. We had these amazing assets, which were by and large state-owned assets. These were beautiful buildings in a state of disrepair in downtown Yangon. We had hundreds of other privately owned buildings. We had hundreds of investors from outside who were lined up, who wanted to invest in these buildings, and some who took the risk and actually invested hundreds of millions of dollars altogether over the past several years. We had local businessmen that wanted to be part of a regeneration effort. We had the potential to set up vocational training and job creation programs for people downtown to be part of that renovation. We had institutions from the IFIs to NGOs abroad who also wanted to join in. And we had in the Yangon Heritage Trust an organization, a local organization that were producing ideas about how we could do this. So what we were missing, however, was that state institutional capacity to pull it all together. We had so many different parts of the Myanmar state, the Yangon regional government, YCDC, the Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Transport. We had issues around traffic and parking, as well as buildings and everything else. And at the end of the day, nothing came together. And nothing came together because we didn't have those state institutions that could pull it together. And YHT as an NGO can do so much on the side, but in the end, it's about a democratically elected parliament deciding, do we want to invest $1 billion, say, in downtown Yangon and make it a world destination and create tens of thousands of jobs, or don't we? And once that democratically elected parliament and government decides that, you need the bureaucracy already in place that can pull these things together, that knows and learns and understands what the opportunities are, that can connect across the board with the private sector as well as the public sector and pull together a plan. And that's just one example of so many in which that extra element of the right kinds of state institutions would make all the difference.
One of the arguments that you might have is that in order for us to learn and reform and build those institutions, we need help, from outside of the country, for the reasons that we discussed before, the education system, the isolation, and other countries that have done that, in the past. I can think of, say, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, or Malaysia had this group of technocrats that were educated abroad. And there's people like you and me who had the opportunity to study abroad and understand that there's so much this wealth of knowledge out there, and why don't we benefit from it? Why don't we invite that in to help build our country so that our people can have a brighter future? Yet I've been back home now for 7 years, and also understand that there's this a bit of distrust of the outside in the and in a way you can't blame people, right? You can't blame people because the outside has so often brought in the bad, not the good. So how do we change that? So to kind of build that trust, to build that realization that, you know, it's about benefiting us. It's, you know, let's listen. Or maybe we have too many. Back in the 2012-13 opening, I think maybe we had poor government was just inundated by well-meaning advisors saying different things, which is another issue as well. But I think now we've kind of gone to, as a society, we're just a little bit wary of the outside.
I think people are wary partly because they're not sure of the direction of travel. And so if a lot of economic issues are couched purely in technical or technocratic terms, people are always going to be wary of exactly what a whole mix of different projects or private sector investments are going to go, because there's a long history of investments and outsiders coming in, displacing people, causing environmental damage, fueling corruption, and everything else. I think people are understandably wary of bringing the state back in any meaningful way into the economy, because a lot of people are just now trying to come out from underneath what they see as decades of extremely repressive and corrupt state practices. And anything that looks like the state being involved in the economy, people will assume, I think quite rightly in many ways, that this will simply provide new rent-seeking opportunities for people, you know, out of their own self-interest. I think the way you get around this is a couple of things. I mean, first is that I think we need to decide, or the country needs to decide, again in a democratic way, does it really want to develop or not? And if it wants to develop, it has to promote certain sectors, whether it's manufacturing. We have to look at the world around us. We have to look at the sectors in the global economy that might be growing. We have to look at the opportunities post this pandemic and really decide, do we want to have this kind of development effort as a country over the coming 5 or 10 years? I think that's first. And I think people need to see what that could look like and what it could mean for them. So I think they need to see what that direction of travel could be, because they're going to be suspicious of the state and they're going to be suspicious of markets as well. And then I think the second part is, you know, when we talk about institutions and people and knowledge and people coming back from abroad and everything else, I think, you know, part of the answer might be that we have to start with some of the easy stuff. If we start with the most difficult initiatives, or the most difficult sectors where there are huge vested interests and venal bureaucracies at work, it's going to be tough, and you'll need people with super management skills to kind of get beyond that, as well as super political skills. But if we take an example like downtown Yangon, which I just mentioned, I mean, no one, I think, was against the development of downtown Yangon. No one was against the regeneration of this area. No one was against, even local community, local developers were not against the kind of vision that we were trying to promote as Yangon Heritage Trust 5-6 years ago. But yet there wasn't that state institution there. And that didn't require a huge state institution. It would have required authority being given to 5 people, 10 people, 15 people at most, working with the Yangon Heritage Trust, which was already set up, and we could have done it. So I think part of it is you do something like that, which might cost, you know, it might be a $500 million project, $1 billion project. You're successful. And then we learn what a Myanmar institution in 2020 that's successful could look like. And then you can replicate it in other areas. So I think we have to look at it from a management direction in terms of where we can start, be successful, and then replicate in this very difficult and in many ways very unique context.
It's not easy, but I think that's what makes it so exciting and interesting. You know, I feel like just being back home, I've been so inspired, because the country that I grew up in, you know, I'm a child of the 70s, growing up in the 80s, it was just stagnation and decay and just hopelessness that just hung in the air. And whatever, you know, difficulties we might be facing today, there is at least possibility and opportunities to lead us to a better place. So for me, I know we've spent the past hour talking mostly about things that can be improved, but the fact that we can talk about it and the fact that we do have an opportunity to improve things, I think is incredibly positive. Kotan, if it's okay, we'll keep going because we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, and I'll just like to maybe address some of those. And one is actually quite a positive question. The question says, what do you think are Myanmar's present strengths that can contribute to build a brighter future for its people?
I think it has a lot of potential and a lot of strengths. As you mentioned, I mean, just the fact that, we came out of a pure military dictatorship 10 years ago, and despite all the challenges and problems, I mean, we do have democratic institutions now. We do have, we're hopefully going to be heading towards a second sort of free and fair election in many generations in just a few months' time. So I think we shouldn't discount the importance of the political freedom that's here. It's not perfect. There are big problems, but it's a much freer society. As you mentioned, we can debate all of these things. Just the fact that we're having this conversation is something that we wouldn't have been able to have before. So I think the at least the partial move towards democracy, I think, is incredibly important, and we should not discount the importance of that. I think that's one. I think the second is that we have a young generation. It's a young country. The average age is 27, 28. And when you talk to young people under 30 or 35, I think many of them are free of the stereotypes, prejudices that some older people might have, or at least are open to new ideas. And we've seen this just from the website you mentioned, the history website, the Lost Footsteps website, a lot of interest in discussing and history and being open to new ways of thinking about the past. So I think young people, despite the fact that the education system here has been so bad over so many generations, I think are a big asset going forward. And then we have the geography of this country, the fact that, on the one hand, we've seen being close to these much bigger countries like China and India as being a threat historically. But I think we need to go on the offensive and embrace this geography as an enormous advantage. But that means moving Myanmar from an insular kind of way of looking at it, way of looking at things, to a much more expansive view of being at the heart of Asia and being a country that can connect East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia as well. So I would say those three things. I mean, the young population, the geographical position of the country, and the fact that we at least have nascent democratic institutions taking us forward. And maybe just to add one last thing, which is that, I think there has been improvements in the economy over the past 10 years. So we are at that crossroads. So I think what we decide to do with the economy right now over these coming few years, I think is going to be really central in terms of whether or not this country goes in the right direction or is going to be bound up again in a new cycle of problems going forward.
No, thank you. Those are great insights. There are two questions that came in that are similar. So I'm just going to try to bind them together. It's regarding your comment about radical anti-discrimination campaign. I think one question saying, how are we doing? How can we reevaluate the core values of the people of the country? And another saying a somewhat similar question: what would your suggestion be to try to end discrimination, and how can we begin to try to tackle this together as a society?
I'm not sure exactly in the details of what a program could look like. But if you look at, for instance, the Anti-Corruption Commission, I mean, that has done some good work over the past couple of years, and since it's been set up, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't set up an anti-discrimination commission, trying to learn best practices from around the world, seeing how it's worked in different countries, not just in advanced countries, but in poor countries. Are there good examples that we can copy, and see how something like that could work? What kind of legislation, new legislation might be necessary as well. And then, as I mentioned before, I think a core part of this program has to be to make sure that the state institutions themselves look like the rest of the country, that they're representative of the country, whether it's civil service, different parts of different ministries, the police, the army. I think all of these institutions have to be inclusive institutions in the sense of including people from all around the country. But I think with that first question about the cultural sort of heritage of this country and the assets, I think that's really important as well. I mean, the vast majority of people in this country are Theravada Buddhist. This is a proud culture that goes back for many centuries. This is a country that has been consistently rated in international indexes as being one of the most generous, if not the most generous, in the world. We have a very strong history of volunteerism. When there's a natural disaster or a problem, hundreds of thousands or millions of people literally volunteer to try to help other people. And we have a strong history of donations to religious institutions, but also to other charities as well. And so the question is, as we move down a certain development track, are these things just to be sort of parked to the side, or are they things that can be harnessed in some way for that development path? And I think these are the kinds of questions that we should be debating very openly, because I don't think there's an easy answer. But I think harnessing these kinds of cultural assets, I think, are also going to be, or should be, an important part of the discussion going forward.
I think with discrimination, one part is also just awareness. And to be very honest, growing up in Yangon, the capital city, in a comfortable family with a Buddhist Burman background, I just didn't even realize the depth of discrimination that exists in this country for different ethnicities, gender or gender identification. And it's really only when I started this Tedx Yangon platform, where we're inviting people to come and share their experiences and ideas, that I realized the other side. And I think having that conversation early on, and having young children do not discriminate, right? And to be able to a different kind of dialogue and different kind of viewpoint to the society, I think, is also going to be quite important.
I mean, let me just add,
please.
Just very briefly, just to add that, at U Thant House, we have lots of visitors. We've been very privileged to have about 5,000 students come and visit the year before we had to shut down temporarily because of the pandemic. And this issue around discrimination is something that we've tried to work with these young people and students with over these past couple of years now. And I think it's been really both enlightening in terms of seeing the depth of the challenges that you've just mentioned, but also seeing the ways in which young people are actually very open to ideas. And I think so we really need to focus on how young people sort of perceive issues around identity and really understand the problems with discrimination that we have really all around us at this point.
Before I go back into questions, I've been meaning to ask as well, what you're doing at U Thant House, because I think it's incredible, this teaching of history that you're trying to do. There was a post by one of our mutual friends the other day. There's a little cartoon that says, everyone should learn history so that you don't repeat the mistakes, but and again, I'm paraphrasing, but then people who learn history still suffer from because other people who haven't learned history do repeat the same mistakes, and we're all kind of in it together. So what are things that you are doing at U Thant House, to enable these conversations, not just with school children, but beyond?
I think we've done a few different things. I mean, first, U Thant House is where U Thant, who's my grandfather, had lived before. So initially it was about trying to preserve the memory of him and his work. And so it's a museum, and people are allowed to come, or people were open to visitors several days a week. At least we were until the pandemic. And then second is, as more and more kids and young people came, we set up specific education projects and programs for them around issues like discrimination, but also around human rights and also around environmental issues, for example. And that's been incredibly successful over these past 18 months or so. And we hope to open our doors to those student groups, again, Myanmar students from Yangon and from elsewhere. The third is that we've had this website, lostfootsteps.org, for about a couple of years now. We've had a couple of million different visits. 90% of the people who come to the website are Myanmar people, young Myanmar people by and large, to try to explore different aspects of Myanmar history. So I think that has been successful. And we've had a huge, for many years now, program of discussions and seminars. So we've had government ministers, we've had people from the ethnic armed groups, we've had leading political figures, but we've also had leading international figures from Kofi Annan to other top UN mediators and special envoys who've worked in other conflicts come and discuss issues, as well as academics, people like Paul Collier and others, who's famous for his work on armed conflicts, amongst other things. And so we've made it into a discussion center in that way. We've had some public discussions as well as private. And now we're going to do a big focus, not just on climate change, which you had mentioned before, but also really in-depth study, probably in collaboration with not just Myanmar think tanks, but some international think tanks, on the political economy of this country, its past, present, and future. Many of the issues that we've discussed over this past hour, I think, will become a new focus in terms of U Thant House's discussion, research and discussion work over the rest of 2020 and 2021.
Well, that'd be fascinating, all the outputs that come out of it. I'd be looking forward to reading those. We have a lot of questions coming in on Facebook Live, just to let the audience know that we are fielding them, and we will try to take as many as possible. Dr. One of these questions, what is your suggestions of ending civil war in this country? This country has the longest history of civil war in the world, and no one can successfully lead to end this conflict. Meanwhile, I do not see progress in peace dialogue between government and ethnic organizations. Look what's happening now in the Rakhine state. Government declared AA as a terrorist organization. The military is trying to suppress ethnic people there. This results in increased tension and lack of trust between the government and local ethnic people.
I think there's so many different issues, and we could go on talking about this for a very long time. But let me just say, I had been part of the peace process from 2011 to 2015 as a special advisor at the Myanmar Peace Center, which was leading the government's negotiations at the time. I think the ceasefire agreement that's on the table, I think that the talks that are happening now, I think that those need to be supported. I think they're ethnic armed organizations that have signed the nationwide ceasefire agreement, and they're hoping to have a new union peace conference sometime over these coming months, perhaps, and that could be an important process going forward. But I think we also need to take a step back, and as the questioner sort of suggested, this has been a period of both peace talks, but actually more intense fighting than we've had in a generation. We had intense fighting in Kachin State, in northern Shan State, and now in Rakhine State with the Arakan Army, which is a new insurgency, and which has really ignited in that part of the country an unprecedented insurrection. I think the most important armed insurrection in this country probably in a few decades. So we have a very, very deep problem that I think we're not even close to seeing a solution to. I think that federalism is often seen as the answer, and I'm definitely in favor of more decentralized government. I'm definitely in favor of ethnic communities and peoples determining their own future in terms of the kind of future that they want. I think there are many advantages of more decentralized government anyway. I think that is something that we should try to work towards. But I think that the real solution to decades of civil war involve first the specific situation in the northeast of the country, where we've had a China border that has been open and ungoverned, not just since the last few decades, and not just since British times, but forever. This has been a frontier. And I think so much of it is locked in the future of our relationship with China. So I think one part of the answer is about what kind of bilateral relationship we want with China. I think that's first. The second is this radical program of anti-discrimination. I think as long as people in this country don't feel like this is their country because they're told they don't belong in some way, or they're second-class citizens as minorities of different ethnic communities, I think that's going to be a problem. And I think ending that discrimination is not just about what happens in the border areas, but what happens in the big cities as well. I think if we can make places like Yangon and Mandalay places where everyone feels they belong and is their home, I think that's as important a step towards peace as anything else. And then thirdly, I think we need that dynamic economic development program that is inclusive and that is exciting and that shows everyone in this country that not just in 100 years, but in 10, 15 years, we can really develop this country in a direction that's good for everyone here. I think that's also, and how to link that to confidence building and other initiatives around the peace process, how to link the right kind of economic development, not just investment and growth that's going to be harmful perhaps for ordinary people on the ground, but real economic development that's going to be good for everyone. How do we link that to the peace process, I think is also an incredibly important part of the picture going forward as well.
Right, and you mentioned China. We actually have a few questions coming in about China, and I'm going to paraphrase some of that. And one is that, how the sort of labor coming in, the Chinese projects, it's how should we view that? And the other is sort of relationships with China. I think one person asked about, the dam and other projects, and there's just a general question of how should we handle the Chinese relationship, and maybe I'll open that up also to say how should we handle sort of foreign policy in general for this country.
I think that, we should handle it in a way that is really forward-thinking, and I think is based on a long-term vision, as we've discussed before, of where this country should go. We shouldn't be on the defensive. I think China is an almost unparalleled industrial revolution, the biggest industrial revolution of our time. And we should be thinking about how we can exploit that industrial revolution rather than simply being on the defensive. I think if we think geopolitically, we are almost certainly entering a kind of a Cold War period between the West, and especially the United States, and China. I think this is a country, like many others in the region, that have a long experience of trying to balance superpowers and stay out of superpower conflicts. But I think we need to look with open eyes at what is going to happen over these coming years, the likelihood of rising tensions between the dominant superpower, the United States, and the rising superpower, China, and really think through as a country what is going to be in this country's best interest. I think if we look on the economic side, in addition to simply trying to be on the offensive and harnessing markets in China and opportunities in China, I think we can only do that if we are on that right development path. And by that I mean, and let me say just a few words more about that, by that I mean that it's a country as a whole, through democratic institutions, deciding what it wants the economy to be in 15 or 20 years. Do we want an economy, for instance, that, like Thailand, has been highly dependent on tourism for revenues, or do we not want that? There's no right or wrong. It's for people to decide of this country. Do we want an economy in which these specific manufacturing sectors are enabled and encouraged, or do we want something else? I mean, these are the kinds of things that people need to decide. And then I think once those decisions are made, and they can be always changed and reformed, I think, as we talked about before, we need the state to help enable the growth of Myanmar companies, Myanmar competencies, Myanmar productivity, Myanmar knowledge, to build up those sectors through Myanmar companies, which could be state-owned companies, or they could be private companies. And then everything else, I think, has to fit within that framework, whether it's the Chinese offering investment around an energy project or around an transport infrastructure project, whether it's about foreign investment coming in. We can't judge, it's impossible to judge how good those investments are, how we should think about it, unless Myanmar itself has its own framework about where it wants to go and how it's going to get there. So I guess my basic point is, with China, as with foreign markets and investment in general, it's not just about, or it shouldn't just be about, opening the borders and allowing in anyone to come in any way possible. It should be about having this clear direction and then fitting foreign investment around the needs of Myanmar organizations to develop within different sectors.
Thank you, Dr. Thant. We have questions on what happened in Kachin State in Pakan with the jade mines, this tragic sort of loss of human life, but it also underlines what you mentioned before. Because of the impoverishment of the country, you have people going in and being scavengers. So the question is, what's your opinion on the government measures with regards to the recent landslide in the jade mines, and what could the government do to improve the livelihoods of people in that area?
I don't think it's about improving the livelihoods of people in that area. I mean, I think there are arguments that can be made for different types of regulation around the jade industry or the future of the jade industry in general. But the underlying problem is that people in this country, there are many millions of people in this country who are so poor that they see no alternative but to be on the side of a jade mine, trying to get what they can to feed themselves and maybe feed their families as well. And so that's urgent. I mean, it's urgent that they have a different choice. It's urgent that they be given the wherewithal, whether it's a job or whether it's simply cash, so that they don't have to risk their lives every day on the side of a jade mine. And that goes back to what we had talked about before in terms of a basic social safety net and security net, not just now around the pandemic or not just around a specific case like the jade mine, but in general for poor people and vulnerable people everywhere in this country. And I think, when we think about industries like jade or mining in general, again, it has to be part of a democratic discussion. We have so many good options in this country. We can go down a development route in which mining is a big part of the future, or we can put that to the side. We can have a route in which agriculture is transformed, and that's a big part of the future, or we can put that to the side. We can have a future in which tourism is important, or we can say we don't want that. We have to have manufacturing. I think that's a national security interest. And I think if we want to industrialize and modernize, we need a manufacturing sector. But what manufacturing sector? Again, there's no right or wrong. We can decide. But I think going back to the people who lost their lives, I think it's really tragic. And I hope that the sentiment that's been expressed on Myanmar social media about what has happened will translate into not just actions that are very specific to those miners and specific or scavengers and poor people in Pakand, but a much bigger discussion about the levels of extreme poverty in this country and what can be done to really urgently address their situation.
The other disaster that we've had, which is in humanitarian terms really tragic, of course, is the Rohingya situation, the Rohingya crisis. And we have a few questions, I think, related to it. One is, could Dr Thant Myint-U share suggestions on the best solution for the Rohingya issue? And a a different question is, why doesn't the central government try to urgently build trust with the AA as innocent civilians are being killed?
I think it's related. I mean, in the sense that one is that I don't see any chance that the situation of the Rohingya or even the kinds of grievances that have given rise to the Arakan army in Rakhine State, I don't see any chance that these can be resolved in isolation. I don't see any chance that we can make in Rakhine some island of peace and prosperity and development and equality that suddenly solves these problems over the coming years. I think we require nationwide solutions. And again, it goes back to the issues that we had talked about before around identity and seeing this in a more complex way, about understanding history in a more complex and multifaceted way. It relates to anti-discrimination across the board. And it relates to a dynamic economic development strategy that pulls everyone along and that everyone will see as something that is exciting and that they want to be part of. We cannot do it in isolation around specific projects. I don't see how the situation of the Rohingya can be dealt with outside of that broader national framework. Now, obviously, for people who are actually refugees or who are IDPs displaced within Myanmar, Rakhine, also Buddhist people who are displaced by recent fighting, I mean, they're very urgent steps that need to be taken simply to protect them, in the sense that making sure that they are not, as civilians, vulnerable either to violence or to a loss of the income that they need. And we just have to remember when we talk about people there, is that, you know, half of the people who are affected are children. So these are not just sort of people in general. Most of these people are kids, hundreds of thousands of kids who've been displaced. And so I think there's an urgent need to simply help them on humanitarian terms. But I think in terms of the larger solution, I think it does require a nationwide kind of rethink of many of these issues. I just don't see anything more than sort of very temporary measures that could be possible.
Thank you, Gotan. I think we'll just address and start wrapping things up, because we've been taking quite a bit of your time. The next question that I'd like to pose to you is about climate change and poverty. Question is about climate change. How should Myanmar prepare a systematic climate change adaptation that is cost of adaptation and actors' perception? I'm not sure if I understand this question, but and mitigation willingness to do to increase to the increasing impact of climate change, because, you know, while there's many challenges in the country, such as lack of capacity, poverty, inequality, and even conflict.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a top priority, because we can ignore the science, or we can listen to the scientists who all say that, you know, it's almost certain now that this world is not just warming and is going to breach the 1 degree, 1.5 degree mark, but it's going to move towards a 2 degree, 3 degree warmer world within the lifetime of people, young people in Myanmar today. And that is going to be absolutely catastrophic for this country because of rising sea levels, because of extreme heat in much of the country for many months of the year. That makes those parts of the country like Mandalay and Magwe regions unlivable, possibly, because of extreme weather events like Cyclone Nargis, which killed 140,000 people in a day. and because of shifting rainfall patterns, which means that agriculture may not be possible in many parts of this country. I mean, civilization in Myanmar took root because of the monsoon weather pattern. I mean, we have had this monsoon weather pattern since agriculture in this country began thousands of years ago. Now that may be changing, so we can't underestimate the importance of this. And in terms of adaptation, I'm not an expert in terms of very, very specific things that might need to take place. I think one part of it has to be that we think about major economic issues, infrastructure planning, the placement of ports, airports, the growth of cities, in the context of the best possible analysis of the climate to come. I think it would be folly to think about making multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure without thinking about where this country is going to be in terms of climate 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So I think that's one. And the only other thing I would say about climate change is that the climate that is changing is not because of Myanmar people. It's not because of what we've done. I mean, there's a lot that's been done to degrade the environment here, but the global climate is changing because of what industrialized and industrializing countries have done over the past many decades. And so we are suffering because of that. So there's an issue of global climate justice as well. And I think Myanmar should be at the forefront of working with other poor countries that are going to be similarly affected to demand both change in policies on the part of industrialized and industrializing countries, but also seek the help that we may need to prepare this economy and this society for what's going to happen over the coming years and decades.
Thank you, Dr. Thant. And I think we'll just do one more question and wrap it up. And that question is on the elections. You know, we have second free and fair elections coming up in a few months. I'm looking forward to voting again for the second time in my entire life. And this time, the landscape is maybe different, maybe not. You know, we have a few additional players coming in with, before it was really a contest between the USDP and the NLD. Now we have individuals like the former speaker, Ushiman, have set up a party. A few prominent members of the NLD have set up parties. And we have then a different conversation as well in the ethnic regions, where some regions might be a little bit disenfranchised from, you know, the current government. So how do you see it all playing? You know, what's your take on what we could expect during the elections?
I hope that it's going to be a free and fair election and that it's going to meet minimum requirements. I think that's likely to be the case. And so then I think the country should congratulate itself on having, again, what I hope is not just free and fair, but also a peaceful election in November. I think that's a really big step forward coming out of military dictatorship. I hope, though, that some of the content around the elections, the deliberations and the run-up to the elections are going to be about some of the issues that we talked about, like discrimination, but also around economic issues that I think are so important to people in this country, and that political parties really articulate clear economic agendas of what, as a political party, if they were in power, how would they spend $20 billion of a government budget, for example? What kind of development path do they see for the country? What sectors, in what way, what foreign investment should this country try to attract? So I think all of those issues are very important. I think that would give weight and content to these democratic elections. My fear is that, you know, we will have a low voter turnout, that many people will already feel that democratic institutions haven't worked for them. My fear is that in many ethnic communities, there's a lot of dissatisfaction and grievances, but because of the nature of our constitution, that they're first past post elections, and also that it's not a direct election to a parliamentary, you know, democracy, but it's to a parliament that then, through an electoral college and a three-way race to be president, chooses the president who then appoints the rest of the government, that many political parties and ethnic parties in particular that may actually grab quite a big percentage of the support of their constituencies may wind up with few or no seats. And so there might be a lot of people on the other side of the November elections who've tried really hard, who do have support, but then have nothing to show for it. And I think that's going to be extremely dangerous. So I think it's a big step forward, but I think if a lot of new political parties, and especially ethnic political parties, don't have much to show for it on the other side, and if the elections are completely unrelated to the big economic issues of the day, then I think that's going to fare not bode well for the future of democratic development in this country more generally going forward.
Thank you, Kotan, and thank you for spending time with us. It's been a fantastic conversation, and I really, am coming away actually, despite all the issues that we discussed, being very positive. And I think my big takeaway is, as a citizen of this country, my demand to people who are our leaders is to have that vision and the strategy, so that we can go towards a better future. Thank you again, Godan. Thank you on behalf of Tedx Yangon and on behalf of all the people who are tuning in now and who will be viewing this in the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.